Many people, this is not uncommon for people to be placed in the chair, the control chair, and taught how to fly the craft. And there's also a very strong spiritual aspect to onboard encounters. People are taught about healing. They're taught about past lives, or astral travel, or channeling, or all kinds of really wonderful spiritual subjects. And that's when I started to reverse my opinions. I'm like, well, this isn't bad at all. This is actually really nice.
Hi and welcome to Ascension Talk with Jenny. This is part 1 out of 2 with Preston Dennett. The next episode will be next week, and today we will talk about onboard encounters, different UFO experiences, but also different beings and missing time, and also Preston's own experience, how he got into this field and his own experiences with different encounters and different beings and sightings. Enjoy. Hi and welcome to my show, Preston. How are you today?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, I'm excited. This is going to be fun.
Oh, and for everyone, can you, instead of me trying to introduce you, so our connection is through Preston Dennett, and that's your sister-in-law, and I'm so happy and thankful to her for introducing me to us, or like connecting us. So could you, because I wanted to talk a little bit more about that as well, because she's worked a lot with you in terms of the drawing and research as well. So can you, just like kind of summarize a little bit who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I am the 5th of 6 children, and grew up in a family that I thought was pretty skeptical of UFOs. Certainly I was. I did not believe in really anything paranormal. And it all changed in 1986. I remember it vividly. I heard about a sighting over Alaska on the news. And it intrigued me. It interested me. I thought, oh my gosh, this pilot who saw a UFO, he's got to be misperceiving or lying or hallucinating. But he was a commercial pilot. And I remember my brother, actually Christy's husband, Mark, had said he'd seen a UFO. And I'm like, Mark, you saw a UFO, right? And he's like, yeah, I told you. I'm like, yeah, but I didn't believe you then. And so he described this incredible sighting he had with his 2 friends. I'm like, what? You weren't alone? I kind of assumed anyone who saw a UFO was alone. And I was like, no, my friends Greg and Phil were there. And we saw this metallic craft. It had a sort of superstructure on top, colored lights, totally silent. It was very close to them. And they actually chased it for several miles. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So that's how it all kind of started for me. And I'm like, wow, how many people do I know who've seen UFOs? And I started asking everybody. And I got a big shock when I found out that I knew many people who had actually really extensive encounters. And gosh, maybe a quarter, 25% of the people I knew, 30, 40% even, had some type of encounter. People at work, where, people I'd loved and trusted, and I knew they weren't lying. I'm like, okay, something is going on here. Let's check out some books and see if I can disprove this. And I got another shock. Turned out this subject was taken very seriously. Had been studied for decades. And there was a government cover-up. All of this stuff just completely left me breathless and just torn. I felt a little scandalized, really. This was not taught in schools. It wasn't taken seriously by the media. And I had to really readjust my whole worldview. I, for some reason, became obsessed with the subject. Did not really think I was involved personally. But now I'm kind of reversing my opinion on that, because I started investigating cases, interviewing people. I joined all the UFO groups. I became a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. And just one thing led to another. Before I knew it, I was writing articles, started appearing on the radio, going to conventions, and then suddenly I'm getting asked to speak And after about, I think it was 10 years of research, I put out my first book, and just never looked back. I've been putting out a lot of books since then.
How many books have you done?
Gosh, I'm almost embarrassed to say. 1996 was when I put out my first book, which was called UFO Healings, and started putting that out a book about once or a year or so, maybe once every couple of years. Now I've got, 27 books on UFOs and all kinds of paranormal subjects as well. They're
great.
all connected in some way.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So in the beginning, because you've done a lot of stuff, like, you've had a lot of different jobs as well, which I think is great. And you seem so curious. Where does that curiosity come from? Does it come from your family?
I've always been very interested in science and just knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge. And finding out UFOs were real really upended my whole worldview. And I don't know why I became so obsessed with the subject, but I really wanted to know the truth. I want to know the truth about things. And I'm not satisfied just to read about it. I want to see it myself. So I was out in the fields camping out where people said they were seeing UFOs. I wanted to see them myself. And same with ghosts. I'm like, what? You had a ghost encounter? Really? And so I was going to haunted houses, and I started doing ghost investigations. And I read about out-of-body experiences. I'm like, wow, people can do this? I'm like, let's try this. So, I always like to dive into the deep end and really immerse myself in whatever I'm studying. So I don't know. I've always kind of been that way. As a very young kid, I was always very curious, always kind of getting into things, and always been kind of had a spiritual bent, listening to the wind and climbing trees and that sort of thing. It's just been a journey, and the UFO subject is so vast and so complicated and has layers and layers to it that it's just really opened up my eyes to a whole new world.
So in 1986, you mentioned, do you call it MUFON? MUFON? Did you contact them to be like kind of an investigator, or did you start it? Like, I don't know too much about it. I'm quite new myself.
Yeah, the Mutual UFO Network is probably the world's largest citizen UFO research organization. It has chapters in every state in the United States and all across the world. And they have conventions and meetings. And I started attending the LA MUFON here in Los Angeles. And I'm like, wow, you can become a field investigator. Okay. You have to take a test. I'm like, this should be interesting. And I found out it was a take-home test. I'm like, well, that's going to be easy, a take-home test. There was no internet in those days, but there were libraries and stuff. So I got the test, and it was hard. It was really hard. The UFO history part was pretty easy for me because by then I had bought like 50 or 100 books. I mean, I have a room filled with books now on UFOs. But there was a lot of questions on photography, on meteorology, astronomy, psychology even, all kinds of questions that were actually pretty difficult. But I studied and I did really well. And I became a field investigator. And that's when I really started buckling down and recording interviews with people and trying to figure out is our planet being invaded by aliens? I can't believe this. And I was not happy at first. I mean, this was a pretty bewildering subject. I'm like, gosh, people are being abducted, kidnapped against their will. This is horrific. I don't know if I like this. But I've since kind of not completely reversed my opinions about the subject, but I'm certainly not afraid of UFOs. I don't think they're here to take over. I don't think they're here to scare people or hurt people. And I think if you look at the evidence objectively, it's actually very encouraging. I think this is a very good thing for humanity. And we are very lucky that we're not alone in the universe. And ET seem to be very, very interested in us. Yeah, I'm absolutely encouraged about what actually happens when someone's taken on board a UFO.
And in terms of the MUFON, like what I meant, like are there different branches in different states, and can you create one yourself? Is that how it works?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that? Yeah, okay, cool. And
Yeah,
is that just for
absolutely.
America, or is it all around the world?
It's all around the world.
Oh, okay.
I think pretty much
Yeah.
most major countries do have MUFON organizations, chapters, I guess you might call them.
Mm-hmm.
Like California, where I live, is a rather large state. I think there's at least 4 or 5 groups here. One in San Diego, a couple here in the LA area, one in Northern California. And you can absolutely become a field investigator and form your own group. And there are state section directors. It's a very sort of federalized organization with a leadership at the top, and they have their monthly journal. And it's a great organization. I support it. It's not without its problems. This is a very controversial field, and there are things that come up in that regard. But yeah, I absolutely do support MUFON. I'm still a member.
Yeah, I just found it. Yeah, it's good to have something and people can reach out to and have a look as well when they start their journey. But I would like to ask you a little bit about the terminology, like, alien, UFO, hybrids, and then maybe go over into different beings, if that's okay with you. Could you just, like, for people, because I got listeners that kind of new to all of this, new and a little bit more experienced, like, for example, me, like, I've always had contact all my life, ever since I was 8. But last year I was like, oh, what's a hybrid? I had no clue. So, and what's a UFO? What's an alien? What's a hybrid? And could you go through that a little bit, please?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
I think that UFO, for me, is an extraterrestrial craft. I know that there are different theories to explain UFOs. Some people think that it might be psychic projections type of things, or even angelic or demonic or what have you. I think if you look at the evidence for UFOs, the extraterrestrial theory is the one that fits best, because what we have are craft that appear on radar. They've been photographed and filmed. There's many, many multiple witness cases involving people of very high level of credibility, really from every level of government, from presidents, governors, representatives, senators, I mean, you name it. Generals and captains and so on. The military across the world is very familiar with this subject. They know it's real, and they have since at least the early 1940s. The evidence involves all kinds of stuff, like landing trace cases. There are thousands of cases where UFOs will leave burned circles on the ground, or radiation readings, or crushed grass. There's medical evidence. People will be struck by a beam of light, perhaps, which might perhaps heal them, or perhaps cause some sort of injury, such as, I would say, like eye strain, or sort of sunburn, perhaps. But animal reaction cases, they can affect all kinds of electromagnetic machines, such as turning off cars or making your radio static or your television. So there's a really wide variety of evidence. I don't think people realize how much truly, there's mountains of evidence. Anyone who doesn't believe in UFOs has really not done their homework. I think anyone who objectively examines the evidence that's in the public arena has to come away convinced that there is definitely something to this. And what I became most interested in is people who've had direct contact because initially this field was all about, hey, let's just record these sightings. This is interesting. And pretty soon these craft were landing. People were reporting seeing humanoids, I guess you would call them, beings, people like us, but looking a little different.
So that's a humanoid.
Yes. And there's many different types. Generally speaking, people report the human form. By that I mean, arms and legs, eyes, mouth, and it's basically the humanoid form is pretty much universal. That's kind of what kept me out of the UFO field. I thought it was a little bit too much like Star Trek, and I wasn't sure I believed it.
It's a documentary, Star Wars and Star Trek.
But it's absolutely true. This is what people are seeing. And most people, in my experience, and I think this is borne out by the research of other people, will see and there's different types for sure. But grays, what we know as grays, is probably the most common type, which are described as generally shorter than the average human. I would say anywhere from 3 feet to 5 feet tall. Large, dark eyes, very small facial features in terms of nose and mouth and ears. Often they wear a jumpsuit, or perhaps it's so skin tight it doesn't even look like they're dressed at all. But I would say 50% at least, maybe up to 70%, see some variation of what we would call the grays. And they can be sort of clinical and very sort of serious and not too emotional, or very loving, very emotional. So you have a real bell curve of that sort of thing. But beyond grays, I would say the next most common category would be human-looking. People who look very much like us, if not pretty much exactly, except perhaps more genetically, I don't want to say perfect, but very beautiful, very muscular. And in all races, by the way, I've heard, dark-skinned, human-looking ones, semi-light-skinned, white, the whole variation that we see here in the human race. And beyond the grays and the human-looking, I'd say the next most common would be praying mantis, the mantids. And that kind of shocked me. I'm like, mantids? Praying mantis, why that? There's so many animals on Earth. Why would they resemble one sort of insect? But this is what we're getting. These are the reports that were coming in. And the praying mantis are described as usually very tall. 6 feet would be on the lower end. Usually it's more like 8 to 9 feet, but can be considerably taller than that, even 10, 12, and in outlying cases up to 15 feet tall. I remember my first case like that. I'm like, wow, are you sure? And the witness was a medic, a Navy medic, a really good trained observer. He's like, I'm telling you, I'm almost 6 feet tall. They were more than twice my height. And I put that story out, and I got a lot of response from other people who'd seen that same sort of 15-foot tall praying mantis.
And what kind of mission do they have here?
Yeah, I think they're very, very intelligent. They're sort of the watchers. They are recording everything. They're watching us very, very closely. And the contactees I've spoken to who have encountered them have said that they can speak any language on Earth and are in contact with the major governments. At least some witnesses have been told this. And have been watching us for a very long time, but particularly since we started exploding nuclear weapons. This is, the modern age of UFOs began in 1947. And that was when there was the Roswell crash in New Mexico. That was when there was the Kenneth Arnold sighting in Washington, which really sort of popularized the term flying saucer. And there was a huge super wave of sightings, which spread across the United States and the world. And ever since 1947, we've had waves and waves of sightings, a slow and steady escalation of contact. Hundreds of thousands of people are seeing UFOs. I think it's much, much more than that because most people don't report it. And what's very interesting is the modern age of UFOs, which is 1947, pretty much coincides exactly with the nuclear age. So I think that's what brought these guys in large numbers. We know UFOs have been around forever. We know this because of petroglyphs and hieroglyphs from Egyptian culture and Middle Age wood carvings and Renaissance paintings and Native American cultures, indigenous cultures across the world talk about star beings coming down, and many believe that we are related to them, or they are our ancestors. So, yes, there's many different types. I'd say there's another category that's just a sort of a catch-all. There's very short humanoids, hairy dwarves, there's light beings, there's tall whites, 10 feet tall, gray-type beings, and many, many just uniquely described figures. One lady contacted me because she's like, have you ever heard of this? And she described this, I believe this 12-foot tall humanoid with a very broad chin, a huge forehead, large eyes, and kind of straw-like orange hair that stuck straight up. But otherwise was basically human-looking. I'm like, well, I couldn't tell her I had ever heard of this. And a good category, I guess what we would call unique humanoids. It's a vast, vast universe out there. There's a lot of beings that are coming and visiting us at this time. For whatever reason, it seems to be a very crucial time for humanity. And actually, the ETs have said as much. And they said that we're on the brink of possibly destroying our planet. And this is the number one message people get beyond, don't be afraid, we won't hurt you, come with us. If they can overcome their fear, they're often, not paralyzed when they're taken on board the craft. They're taken to another room and given warnings about nuclear proliferation or pollution or earth changes or our warlike ways. Or they're taken to the engine room and literally told how the craft works, which is usually somewhere along electromagnetic lines, something along those lines. Many people, this is not uncommon for people to be placed in the chair, the control chair, and taught how to fly the craft. And there's also a very strong spiritual aspect to onboard encounters. People are taught about healing. They're taught about past lives, or astral travel, or channeling, or all kinds of really wonderful spiritual subjects. And that's when I started to reverse my opinions. I'm like, well, this isn't bad at all. This is actually really nice. And I have to tell you, the people I talk to have had onboard encounters are, generally speaking, super psychic. They're super enlightened people. They're very, very kind. And I'm like, well, who's having contact? What type of person is being contacted? And I did find some patterns. It's pretty evenly divided between men and women. That does not seem to be a factor. It's not age. It's not where you live. It's not your religion or your political affiliations. It's none of that. The real pattern I found was, two things. One, it does seem to be following family lines. If your parents have had encounters, likely you will too, or your children. It does seem to sort of track generations. But beyond that, it's people, this was so interesting to me, it's people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. And by that I mean the people who are having contact are doctors, they're inventors, they're environmentalists, they're social workers, they're artists, they're writers, they're teachers, police officers, entertainers. And that sort of pattern. It's a loose pattern, but it keeps turning up over and over again. I'm like, wow, this, again, I think speaks towards who these beings are and why they're here. If they're contacting musicians, they love musicians. These are all people who are having a strong influence on humanity's spiritual progress. And I think that's really good news.
Very true. I can really agree with you, Preston. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more, if you have had any experience yourself, because we talked a little bit before we started this about dream and reality. Sometimes it's like some people want concrete physical proof. Sometimes you see and you connect in dreams, and some times through channeling, and so could you share a little bit more about your own?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, when I first started investigating UFOs, I had a real strong spiritual awakening as well, and started remembering past lives, started having out-of-body experiences, precognition, and all of this. And I'm like, well, gosh, why am I so interested in this? Have I had any encounters? And I scoured my past, looking like, well, gosh, I don't see any incidents of missing time. I just, I don't know. But as soon as I started really investigating, I did start having encounters. And it was shocking to me. I remember, it was just a couple of years into my research. I think this was around 1992 or so. I was over at my brother's house, Mark and Christine, because she was really helping me a lot through all this. And she's had encounters herself. It took her a while to tell me that, but she eventually did tell me about her encounters as a little girl. And I was just out of my mind with this subject, trying to wrap my head around it. And I remember I was like, all right, it's getting late, guys. I got to drive home. I've got work tomorrow. I've got to go. It was late July 1992, I think, and I'm driving away from their house to where I lived, which was 5 miles away, and driving very slowly. It was a tight little residential street. I'm coming around this hairpin corner when what I thought at first was a bird came swooping down from about 300 feet high towards my car. And I instantly looked up and I saw, well, that's not a bird. Maybe it's a firecracker. Because, it's late July. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's fireworks. But it clearly wasn't, because it was a ball of light. It was a small ball of light, about the size of a golf ball, maybe a little larger. And this darn thing comes swooping down in front of my windshield and stops. And it was, I'm not kidding, 2 feet away, maybe even closer, a foot, right in front of my windshield. It goes back and forth, 2, maybe 3 times, stops, and shoots straight up. And that's all I remember. I don't remember going home. I actually forgot about it. I didn't tell anybody because I didn't remember it myself. I think I had missing time. It took me a couple of years to sort of come to that conclusion. Because I always would tell people, like, yeah, I had this sighting, and it was this ball of light, and that's where I would leave it. But one day I remembered, like, I don't even remember going home. and that's weird, because I would have subsequent sightings, and I always would, like, oh, wow, talk about it immediately afterwards. I'd write it down. I'd call everyone up, like, I saw a UFO. And, following that, started seeing them fairly regularly, once every couple of years. Often it would be like after I'd contacted a contactee, and I'd be interviewing them, and like one instance, one of my best sightings, I was interviewing this lady who was just having crazy experiences, and just the full gamut of them. I mean, full on hybrids. I didn't get into the hybrids, half human, half ET. I started getting cases like that from the very beginning. That's one of the alien agendas, particularly the Greys. They're reinvigorating their race. They are mixing their DNA with ours to sort of, they're basically human, but they've sort of been genetically damaged. And so they're trying to reinvigorate their genetics. And I was transcribing this lady's interview, and I'm like, gosh, I wonder if she's telling the truth. I kind of knew she was. I mean, I'd interviewed her face to face. She was a lovely woman. She actually lives in Australia right now.
Cool.
And I'm like, gosh, I wonder, because her story was so amazing. And I got this really strong impulse to run into the roof of my condo. And I couldn't resist it. I'm like, wow, what am I doing? I grabbed my glasses. I'm slightly nearsighted. And ran into the roof of the condominium complex. I lived on the 3rd story. And you're not supposed to go on the roof. It's against the rules. And I don't, I'm a good guy. I don't go up there. Why would I? And couldn't resist, ran onto the roof. I'm like, what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. When suddenly this UFO appears. And it was this bright orange orb, a globe. It was fairly large. I couldn't quite tell, but looked like it was right across the street to me. This fiery orange orb, and it blasted me with a telepathic message. And boy, that was a surprise, because I've never had anything like that happen to me. And it said, "Hi, it's us." I'll call her Wendy. "We're Wendy's ETs. You didn't believe? Well, watch this." And not in those words exactly, but the message was clear. I mean, it was really crystal clear. "It's us. You don't believe? Huh? Watch this." And this thing starts darting around, back and forth, really spectacularly, in what I would call non-conventional movements, right angles, or actually much more acute angles than right, doing things no balloon or plane or anything can do. And that was such an amazing sighting. It was very brief, and maybe 30 seconds. I was breathless. I fell back. I'm like, wow. I ran downstairs. I think I called her up immediately. I'm like, "Wendy, you're not going to believe it. Your ETs came to say hi to me and prove that you were telling the truth." It's like, "I told you I was telling the truth. What do you mean?" I'm like, wow, I know. But yeah, and she ended up showing me a UFO again. And since then, yeah, fairly regularly they'll show up. Like after I've written a book, almost like a congratulatory sighting. Like say, "Hey, good job." Or if I don't write a book for a year, they'll show up like, "Get to writing." And I do feel like I have a mission I do feel like I'm very strongly driven to get the word out about the ET presence on our planet.
And thank you for that, from all of us. And what kind of ETs were contacting you? Do you know what kind?
I believe, moving forward, I've more recently been having very powerful, what I would call UFO dreams. And having
Please tell.
Having interviewed a lot of people, that's one of my questions. I'm like, "So tell me about your dreams," because that's a very strong indication. There's a whole list of questions I ask, like, "Have you seen orbs of light? Have you had missing time? Do you have a strong emotional reaction to this subject? Have you had any unexplained healings?" And all of these are like check, red flags. And I started having UFO dreams. And more recently, I had a dream where I came upon thought I was visiting somewhere, like a hotel or something. I found myself in this room. And I'm looking around, I'm like, "Well, this is strange. These walls are metal. Like, where could this be?" And I looked at the walls, and I'm like, "Wow, they're curved. Look at that." The floor, was level, of course, but it curved right up into the ceiling. Up into the wall, and the wall curved into the ceiling. And I'm like, whoa, that's the same thing I've heard from other people. And this guy walks up to me, and I had to look up at him. He was 8 feet tall, maybe 7, 8 feet tall, wearing a white sort of outfit, and very kind, and very just wise. And just the energy coming off of him was like, "Wow, you are wonderful." And I couldn't see his face. I could not focus on his face, no matter how hard I tried. And I thought that was so interesting to me, because I've had so many people tell me that. Like, I can't really tell you what they look like. I had a really hard time seeing what they looked like. And now I know what they're talking about. And I was allowed to wander around the craft. I was very polite. I kept my hands, clasped behind my back. I didn't want to bust into anything. But part of the wall turned transparent, and I could see outside into this water area. That was another wow, I've had this described to me so many times. When someone's inside a UFO, it's not like windows like we would describe them with a frame. Just the wall will turn transparent. And sometimes entire craft. People are like, "Oh, I'm floating in space." It was like Wonder Woman's jet. It was just like floating in space. And that's sort of what happened to me. And this was all very dreamlike, but super sort of lucid, I guess you might call it. And I woke up and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I think I had a UFO dream. And I think they are aware of me. I know they are, because I once asked a contactee to go on TV. She's like, sure, I'll do it. It's a public access channel, pretty small little program. And she called me up a couple of days before we were supposed to do the shoot, I guess. And she's like, no, I can't go on. The ETs came and they don't really want any publicity right now. So that made me realize, like, ooh, they're watching us very closely. And little things like that began to happen that made me realize, I would have a sighting. And they were talking to me like that. I'm like, well, gosh, on some level, I think, I'm a contactee. Oh, my God. And that was thrilling when I kind of came to that realization, like, on some level, I am having contact. Maybe not the level of, like, the people I interview, but it's starting to ramp up now, and I'm super excited.
Thank you so much for tuning in to my show today, and all the links to Preston and what we talked about today will be on my website ascensiontalk.com, and head over to the blog there. And this is episode number 9, and next week will be episode number 10, and then we talk more about USOs, or the undersea UFO bases, healing on board ships, and also marks and abduction marks, and much, much more. Thank you for your support, and thank you for all the feedback I get, and you're more than welcome to email me. It's ascensiontalkpodcast@gmail.com. And if you are a experiencer yourself and have a story to tell, let me know there as well and email me, or you can go to ascensiontalk.com. I got the contact there. And thank you. And until next time, please ground yourself, heal yourself. Catch you soon. Bye.